You know that saying, never judge a book by its cover? Well, this Yale graduate banker didn't get the memo. He called his future father-in-law unrefined, old-fashioned, and even embarrassing. But what he didn't know, that same unrefined man was quietly investigating him for months. And on the wedding day, right when the bride walked down the aisle, the FBI stormed in. The truth that came out next destroyed careers, shattered families, and turned one picture-perfect wedding into a national scandal. This is not just a story of arrogance, it's a story of justice, revenge, and a $2.3 million fraud that no one saw coming. Stay till the end, because the final twist will make your jaw drop. The sun shone brightly on a quiet suburban street, glinting off the pristine lawns and sparkling windows of perfectly curated homes. Inside one of these homes, nestled among neatly trimmed hedges, was the residence of Richard Hayes, a Yale graduate, investment banker, and soon-to-be husband of Emily Thompson. To the world, Richard seemed flawless, charming, well-dressed, with an Ivy League pedigree that impressed everyone he met. But beneath the tailored suits and confident smiles, there was a man whose arrogance knew no bounds. Richard had met Emily 2 years ago at a charity gala in Manhattan. She was smart, beautiful, and from a family he considered quaint, unrefined. He had whispered to a colleague over cocktails after meeting her father, Jonathan Thompson. Jonathan, a retired FBI analyst, ran a modest security consulting firm and had a quiet, methodical demeanor. Richard's words had been dismissive, but Emily had laughed them off, thinking Richard was just playfully arrogant. In truth, she had no idea the depth of his condescension or the danger it would bring. From the beginning, Richard had carefully curated the image of the perfect fiancé. Social media posts showed him buying Emily extravagant gifts, whisking her away to exclusive resorts, and making grand romantic gestures that looked effortless. Friends marveled at his success and charm, but behind closed doors, he was controlling, calculating, and ruthless. Any conversation about money, investments, or future plans quickly revealed his manipulative side. He had spent years building a hidden portfolio of shady investments and illicit financial schemes, meticulously covering his tracks. To outsiders, he was a banker at the top of his game. To insiders, he was walking on the edge of a legal cliff. Meanwhile, Jonathan, Emily's father, had taken a different approach to life. He valued integrity above all, taught his children the importance of honesty and respect, and had spent his career uncovering frauds like the one Richard was quietly orchestrating. When he first met Richard, he had been polite but skeptical. Something in Richard's demeanor didn't sit right with him. There was a subtle arrogance, a dismissive air that, to Jonathan, screamed trouble. Over the next year, Jonathan observed quietly, sensing irregularities not just in Richard's stories, but in patterns only a seasoned analyst would notice. It all came to a head one evening, when Emily invited her father to a private dinner with Richard. They sat at a candlelit table, with the aroma of roasted lamb and fine wine filling the air. Richard, as always, exuded charm. But then came the fateful comment. "Your lifestyle is quaint," he said, swirling his wine with an exaggerated flourish. "Honestly, Jonathan, you live like it's the 1980s. No offense." Jonathan's eyes didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, studying Richard as if he were peeling away layers of a particularly fragile mask. "No offense taken," Jonathan replied evenly. "I've always found that integrity lasts longer than appearances." Richard laughed lightly, dismissing the remark. But Jonathan's mind began to connect the dots. Over the past months, he had been noticing discrepancies in public records, financial statements, and subtle patterns in Richard's movements. He began quietly investigating, using the skills honed during decades of federal service. Emails, bank statements, and hidden ledgers painted a picture of fraud so extensive it made Jonathan's blood run cold. $2.3 million siphoned through shell companies, offshore accounts, and complex investment maneuvers designed to evade scrutiny. As Richard planned the wedding with his usual flair for extravagance, Jonathan quietly built his case. He reached out to former colleagues in the FBI, gathered documents, and traced financial transactions. All of it pointed to one inescapable truth. Richard's empire was built on deception, but Jonathan didn't act hastily. He knew that exposing Richard before the wedding would risk alerting him, potentially causing him to disappear with both Emily and the stolen funds. Jonathan had to be meticulous, precise, and most importantly unseen. Meanwhile, Emily was caught between worlds. She adored Richard, believing him to be her perfect partner, and yet, subtle hints of his arrogance sometimes gnawed at her conscience. He often belittled her family in casual remarks, painting their modest lifestyle as inferior. Emily's friends warned her, but she dismissed their concerns, blinded by love and the glamorous image Richard presented. As the wedding approached, Jonathan's investigation reached a critical point. He discovered that Richard's fraudulent activities weren't just about money. They were about power, control, and a desire to manipulate everyone around him. With each new piece of evidence, Jonathan's plan crystallized. He wouldn't just expose Richard quietly. He would ensure that the truth came out in a way that no one could ignore. The stage was set. Invitations had been sent, the venue booked, and every detail meticulously arranged. Friends and family buzzed with excitement, unaware that beneath the shimmering chandeliers and floral arrangements, a storm was quietly brewing. Jonathan's phone buzzed late one night. A former FBI colleague had confirmed that the financial trail was solid, that every fraudulent transaction had been documented, and that federal authorities were ready to act. Jonathan felt a surge of resolve. This was more than a personal vendetta, it was justice, and it would unfold in the most dramatic way possible. During the wedding itself, Richard continued to boast about his success, oblivious to the fact that his carefully constructed world was about to crumble. He posted glamorous selfies online, bragged about the luxurious honeymoon he had planned, and laughed about the quirky habits of his future in-laws. But in the shadows, Jonathan moved with quiet precision, coordinating with the FBI, preparing evidence, and ensuring that the moment of truth would be undeniable. By the day of the wedding, tension crackled like electricity in the air. Guests arrived, unaware of the secret drama about to unfold. Emily walked down the aisle radiant, in a gown that shimmered under the sunlight. Richard stood at the altar, smug and confident, certain that his charm and status would impress everyone. But Jonathan's eyes were sharp, focused, and unwavering. He had waited patiently for this day, ensuring that every piece of evidence, every witness, and every procedural step was in place. The ceremony began, and the crowd's applause filled the air. Richard smiled, leaning slightly toward Emily, whispering a comment about how perfect the day was. But Jonathan's gaze never wavered. He knew the perfect moment was coming, because at the end of this day, under the very chandeliers that sparkled above the guests, the truth would explode, the facade would shatter, and Richard Hayes, the arrogant Yale graduate, would learn that some masks, no matter how expertly crafted, are destined to fall. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Richard Hayes' penthouse, glinting off the marble countertops and polished glass surfaces. To anyone walking past, the scene was the picture of success: luxury cars in the driveway, a pristine interior, and a man who radiated confidence. Richard sipped his espresso while reviewing his latest financial reports. Numbers danced across the spreadsheets, each one carefully manipulated to create the illusion of legitimate growth. He was, by all outward appearances, untouchable, but the truth was far more precarious. Each account, each transaction, each shell company he had set up was a thread in a web of deception, one misstep away from unraveling. His $2.3 million fraud wasn't just about stealing money, it was about control. Investors, clients, and even his closest associates trusted him implicitly, unaware that Richard had siphoned funds into offshore accounts and secret investments, masking every trace with layers of financial trickery. Richard's arrogance was not limited to his finances. He looked down on everyone who didn't match his high standards or, in his words, his elite vision. Friends of Emily, family gatherings, even casual dinners became opportunities for him to assert superiority. "It's just quaint here," he had remarked at a family brunch, smirking at the modest spreads and traditional decor. Emily's father, Jonathan, had remained silent that day, but the remark festered in his mind. Every word Richard spoke, every small insult, only strengthened Jonathan's resolve. Jonathan had spent weeks tracking Richard's movements, piecing together fragments of financial activity that pointed toward large-scale fraud. His retired FBI instincts had never dulled. In fact, they had sharpened with time. He knew where to look, how to cross-reference, and how to interpret even the smallest inconsistencies. Over the past year, he had quietly accessed public filings, interviewed former associates, and used discreet channels to trace Richard's offshore accounts. One particularly striking discovery had come from a seemingly innocuous invoice. A routine payment for consulting services in the Cayman Islands was flagged as suspicious. Jonathan dug deeper, uncovering a series of shell companies, each layer more opaque than the last. Payments bounced through these entities, ultimately landing in accounts registered under Richard's alias. The sums added up millions of dollars, and the method was elegant, calculated, and dangerous. But Richard's arrogance blinded him to the fact that he had left traces behind. Jonathan had learned to read between the lines, to notice small anomalies that most would overlook. Slight changes in corporate filings, delays in tax reporting, patterns in international wire transfers. It was enough for a seasoned investigator to connect the dots, and Jonathan, with his intimate knowledge of fraud tactics and insider insight, had built a map of Richard's financial empire that was undeniable. Meanwhile, Emily remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her. She had been drawn into Richard's world of opulence and charm, completely convinced that he was the perfect man. Every gift, every romantic gesture, every meticulously planned event reinforced her belief. She didn't see the tension in her father's eyes, the quiet moments when Jonathan would disappear into his home office for hours at a time, poring over documents and financial records. The wedding planning continued at a frantic pace. Richard had spared no expense. A luxurious venue, gourmet catering, designer floral arrangements, and a guest list that included prominent figures from finance, politics, and society. To him, it wasn't just a celebration, it was a showcase of his superiority. He reveled in the attention, convinced that the spectacle would cement his image as a man of taste, class, and achievement. But Jonathan's plan was already in motion. He had coordinated discreetly with former FBI colleagues, ensuring that every piece of evidence would be authenticated, every wire transfer traceable, and every fraudulent account linked to Richard beyond dispute. The approach was surgical. They weren't just aiming to catch him, they were orchestrating a public, undeniable exposure that would leave no room for escape or denial. The tension reached a boiling point one evening when Jonathan confronted Richard under the guise of a casual dinner at home. Emily had gone to the spa for a few hours, giving father and fiancé a rare opportunity for private conversation. Jonathan remained calm, a mask of neutrality on his face, while Richard prattled on about his latest business ventures. "I've been reviewing some of your investments," Jonathan began evenly, sliding a folder across the table. "Do you mind explaining these offshore transactions?" Richard glanced at the documents, feigning disinterest. "Oh, those? Just standard portfolio management. Nothing unusual." Jonathan leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Standard? Richard, these transactions Link to accounts registered under your name or aliases you control. Over $2.3 million has moved through shell companies with no legitimate business purpose. For the first time, a flicker of unease crossed Richard's face. He laughed nervously, trying to dismiss the accusation. "You're overthinking it, Jonathan. I run complex operations. It's part of being in finance." Jonathan's expression didn't waver. "I've confirmed everything. Bank records, corporate filings, international transfers. It's all documented. And I've already alerted the authorities." Richard's face paled. He had underestimated Jonathan completely. The quiet, unassuming man he had mocked was now orchestrating the end of his empire. Panic set in. His mind raced. How could he have been so blind? Every precaution he had taken, every falsified document, every shell account was about to be exposed. As the wedding day approached, Richard's behavior grew erratic. He tried to maintain his charm for Emily and the guests, but Jonathan noticed subtle signs of stress: trembling hands, hurried phone calls, veiled threats to associates. Jonathan's plan, however, was meticulous. The FBI was ready. Evidence had been verified. Witnesses had been briefed. Every detail had been accounted for. On the eve of the wedding, Jonathan finally felt a sense of grim satisfaction. Richard's arrogance had led him to this point. He believed himself untouchable, believing that charm, pedigree, and wealth could shield him from scrutiny. But justice, as Jonathan knew, doesn't care about appearances. It only cares about facts, and the facts were damning. The final piece of Jonathan's plan involved patience and timing. The wedding would be the perfect stage. Richard's hubris would be on full display, and the FBI's intervention would be immediate and undeniable. He envisioned the moment, the guests frozen in shock, Emily's confusion turning to horror, and Richard's carefully constructed world collapsing in real time. As night fell, the penthouse shimmered with city lights, and Jonathan reviewed his checklist one last time. Every document, every wire transfer, every account, every witness ready. The next day, Richard Hayes Wood learned the harsh reality of underestimating a man who had spent decades uncovering the truths others sought to hide. And the day of the wedding would not just be about vows, champagne, and celebrations. It would be about exposure, consequences, and a lesson in arrogance that no one present would ever forget. Morning of the wedding arrived like a scene from a movie. The sun rose over the sprawling estate where Emily and Richard's ceremony would take place, bathing the manicured gardens and elegant marble pillars in golden light. A string quartet tuned their instruments, servers arranged bouquets, and makeup artists flitted around bridesmaids, ensuring every detail was flawless. It was, by all appearances, a day of celebration. But behind the sparkling chandeliers and white rose arrangements, a storm brewed that no one could anticipate. Richard woke early, checking his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror of his suite. His sharp tuxedo was immaculate, every cufflink gleaming. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair and smiled at himself in the mirror. Today, he thought, would be the pinnacle of his life, a perfect image of success, charm, and prestige. He didn't see the undercurrent of dread creeping beneath his confidence, a subtle whisper from the chaos he had meticulously tried to avoid. Emily, radiant in her gown, floated down the hall in a cloud of silk and lace, her excitement palpable. Her heart raced, not with fear, but with joy. Today, she would marry the man she loved, the man she thought was perfect. She had no inkling that this day, meant to be a celebration, was about to be transformed into a stage for betrayal, justice, and exposure. Jonathan, Emily's father, moved with quiet determination. Dressed sharply but unassumingly, he slipped between staff and vendors, checking his watch, making sure the timing was precise. He had spent months preparing for this moment. Every wire transfer, every fraudulent account, Every shred of Richard's deceit had been meticulously documented. Every detail had been confirmed by the FBI, who were strategically positioned nearby, ready to act the instant Jonathan gave the signal. The first guests began to arrive, dressed in their finest. Unaware of the tension lurking beneath the polished exterior, Richard greeted them with practiced charm, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, and making everyone feel as if they were part of a grand, joyous celebration. He smiled broadly, confident that his empire of deception would remain intact. But for Jonathan, every handshake, every smile, every movement of Richard's body was a countdown toward inevitable revelation. The ceremony was set in a sun-drenched courtyard, floral arches framing the scene like a picture-perfect postcard. Chairs were lined neatly, champagne flutes glistened in the sunlight, and the gentle murmur of guests created a soft, expectant hum. Emily's mother discreetly shot her father a questioning glance. Sensing his unusual focus, Jonathan simply nodded toward the arch, silently signaling that the moment had almost arrived. Inside the penthouse suite, Richard double-checked the seating chart and final touches. He was meticulous, obsessive, and like always entirely blind to the danger closing in. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages from vendors, friends, and business associates. Each buzz made his smile tighten slightly, but he shrugged it off, convinced it was all routine. At precisely 2:00 p.m., the music swelled, signaling the start of the ceremony. Guests rose as Emily appeared at the end of the aisle, her father by her side. Richard's smile widened as he watched her glide toward him, the culmination of his years-long quest to secure both love and status. He took her hand, leaning in close to whisper, "You look perfect." Emily's eyes sparkled, oblivious to the hidden tension beneath her father's calm demeanor. Jonathan, however, remained vigilant, every detail logged and memorized. He had rehearsed this day in his mind countless times. Timing, precision, and discretion were paramount. One misstep could allow Richard to evade justice at the very moment his arrogance was at its peak. As the officiant began the ceremony, Jonathan's gaze subtly flicked toward the security team stationed along the perimeter of the estate. They were positioned to intervene seamlessly, and every agent had a clear line of sight to Richard and his entourage. The plan was simple but unyielding. No public scandal would be allowed to unfold prematurely. But the moment Richard stepped over the threshold into criminal exposure, the authorities would strike. Richard, still smiling and unaware of the undercurrents, continued to play the part of the perfect groom. He leaned toward Emily occasionally, whispering jokes and compliments, projecting an image of confidence and control. Yet, internally, he felt a faint unease and indistinct sense that something was off. He brushed it away, attributing it to pre-wedding nerves. Suddenly, Jonathan's phone vibrated with a discreet alert from the FBI. Every financial link had been verified, every witness briefed, and every piece of evidence authenticated. The moment had arrived. Jonathan's eyes met those of the agents across the courtyard. A subtle nod, silent, almost imperceptible, was all it took. Within seconds, the carefully orchestrated storm descended. Agents moved with quiet precision, approaching the venue entrances. The officiant, unaware of the unfolding drama, continued reading the ceremony script. Guests murmured in confusion as uniformed officers appeared, strategically positioned, ensuring that the operation would unfold with minimal disruption. To the innocent attendees, Richard's eyes widened, a flicker of panic overtaking the practiced calm. What's going on?" he stammered, his voice shaking. He glanced around, realizing that the carefully constructed facade he had maintained for so long was crumbling in real time. "Mr. Hayes," an agent said firmly, "you are under arrest for fraud and embezzlement. Federal authorities are executing a warrant based on evidence of a $2.3 million financial scheme." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Emily's hands flew to her mouth, confusion and horror etched on her face. Guests whispered in shock, some reaching for their phones to capture the scene. Richard, stunned and disoriented, struggled to maintain his composure. For the first time, his arrogance faltered under the weight of undeniable evidence and public exposure. Jonathan stepped forward, his demeanor calm but authoritative. "Richard," he said, his voice steady, "you underestimated integrity. You overestimated charm. And now, the truth is here." Richard's face turned pale as he realized the full magnitude of the situation. Years of deceit, manipulation, and fraud had led to this singular moment. Public exposure, immediate legal consequences, and the complete collapse of the persona he had spent a lifetime crafting. The agents began processing the scene, guiding Richard toward a waiting vehicle. The crowd remained frozen, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and fascination painting every expression. Emily, tears streaming down her face, looked at her father with a mix of gratitude and anguish. Jonathan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Justice had been served, but the day had been irreversibly altered. As Richard was led away, the reality of his situation became undeniable. His arrogance, charm, and wealth could no longer shield him. The life he had built on lies had crumbled in a matter of moments, exposed for all to see. And in that instant, the lesson was clear. No amount of deception, no matter how clever, could withstand the force of truth. The wedding, meant to celebrate love and union, had transformed into a spectacle of justice. Guests would remember this day forever, not for the vows exchanged, but for the dramatic downfall of a man who had believed himself untouchable. And amid the chaos, Jonathan knew that his meticulous planning had succeeded. Justice had been delivered, and the arrogant Yale banker would face the consequences of his actions, not behind closed doors, but in full view of those he sought to impress. The day after the wedding unfolded like a nightmare for Richard Hayes. Overnight, social media had exploded with images and videos of his arrest. Headlines screamed across news outlets: Yale graduate banker arrested for $2.3 million fraud during wedding, and bride's father exposes arrogant groom in stunning FBI bust. Friends, colleagues, and associates stared in disbelief, unable to reconcile the charming, sophisticated man they knew with the criminal now facing federal charges. Richard spent his first night in a holding cell, pacing back and forth, his mind a chaotic storm. The reality of his situation had settled heavily upon him. Every bank account he thought was hidden, every shell company he had believed untouchable, and every carefully constructed lie had been meticulously traced and documented. The FBI's operation had been flawless, coordinated, precise, and inescapable. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit room, he replayed the wedding in his mind. The moment Jonathan gave the subtle nod to the agents, his carefully constructed world had collapsed. His smirk, once confident and unwavering, had been replaced by fear. In those brief moments before he was escorted away, he realized something fundamental: arrogance, wealth, and social status could not protect him from the truth. Meanwhile, Emily struggled to process the whirlwind of emotions. Shock, confusion, grief, and anger collided in her mind. The man she had loved, trusted, and envisioned a future with was now the central figure in a federal criminal case. She felt betrayed, not just by Richard, but also by the life she had been led to believe was real. Her father, Jonathan, remained a steady anchor, providing comfort while carefully navigating the aftermath. "Emily," he said gently, "know this is overwhelming, but remember, justice was done. He tried to manipulate you, your family, and countless others. Now, it's exposed, and he will be held accountable." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I can't believe I didn't see it. How could I have been so blind?" Jonathan pulled her into a hug. "You weren't blind. You were in love. People like him are skilled at hiding who they really are. The important thing is, We uncovered the truth before it was too late. Across town, Richard's legal team scrambled to mitigate the damage. Attorneys pored over documents, attempting to find loopholes, inconsistencies, or procedural errors that could save him. But the evidence was overwhelming. Wire transfers, shell companies, falsified records, and corroborating testimony left almost no room for defense. His arrogance, which had fueled his deception, now seemed almost comical in its futility. Court dates were scheduled quickly, with federal prosecutors preparing a comprehensive case. Richard's social media accounts, once filled with selfies of luxury yachts, expensive watches, and vacation destinations, were now flooded with public condemnation. The man who had believed himself untouchable was now a subject of ridicule, scandal, and legal scrutiny. Emily, trying to move forward, faced a complex emotional landscape. The wedding she had dreamt of had been hijacked by crime and scandal. Family members rallied around her, offering love and support, but the betrayal cut deep. Friends reached out with messages of sympathy, some expressing horror at Richard's audacity, others offering a listening ear. Each conversation reinforced the reality: the man she had loved was gone, not just from her life, but from the life he had tried to build around deception. Jonathan, however, maintained his quiet vigilance. His role in exposing Richard had been necessary, but he knew the aftermath required careful attention. Legal proceedings, media inquiries, and family healing all demanded patience, intelligence, and emotional resilience. He coordinated with authorities, ensuring that evidence remained secure, witnesses were prepared, and the case moved forward without interference. As weeks turned into months, the fallout became increasingly public. Richard faced arraignments, hearings, and media scrutiny. Every move he made was documented and dissected, from court appearances to financial disclosures. His family, once proud of his Ivy League education and professional success, began to distance themselves, embarrassed and disillusioned. The life he had meticulously built, carefully curated for social media, friends, and potential investors, crumbled entirely. For Emily, the process of healing was complex. Therapy sessions, family support, and careful reflection became essential. She learned to separate the man she had loved from the criminal he had hidden behind charming smiles and Ivy League credentials. With her father's guidance, she began to reclaim control over her life, gradually understanding that the exposure of Richard's crimes, though devastating, had also protected her from a far greater betrayal in the future. Jonathan, quietly proud, remained a steady presence. His meticulous planning, patience, and unwavering commitment to truth had not only exposed Richard, but also prevented him from continuing his scheme. Yet he understood the deeper lesson for Emily and her family: the importance of integrity, vigilance, and discernment in a world where appearances can be dangerously deceiving. As the legal proceedings intensified, Richard's desperation grew. Attempts to negotiate plea deals, shift blame, or manipulate witnesses all failed. Under the weight of meticulously documented evidence, each court session served as a public reminder of his hubris, arrogance, and criminal ingenuity, once hidden, now fully exposed. Emily, reflecting on the entire ordeal, realized that her life had been irreversibly changed. Yet amidst the chaos, she found clarity. She recognized the strength of her family, the importance of critical thinking, and the power of truth. Though Richard had caused emotional devastation, his exposure became a catalyst for growth, resilience, and a deeper understanding of human complexity. Months later, as the court delivered sentencing, Richard Hayes faced the consequences of his actions. The full $2.3 million fraud was revealed, along with the calculated methods he had employed to conceal it. The judge, acknowledging the severity and premeditation of his crimes, imposed a substantial sentence, ensuring that Richard would not easily rebuild the empire he had lost. In the aftermath, Emily emerged stronger. Her relationship with her father deepened, and the family began to heal. The wedding, once a symbol of love and celebration, had transformed into a story of justice, resilience, and the power of truth to expose even the most meticulously constructed lies. Jonathan, having fulfilled his role as protector and investigator, quietly reflected on the events. Justice had been served, but the real victory lay in ensuring that Emily and the many others who might have been affected were shielded from further harm. The lessons learned, though painful, forged a stronger foundation for the future: integrity, vigilance, and the unwavering pursuit of truth. The courthouse was packed with spectators, reporters, and legal personnel. Flashbulbs popped relentlessly as cameras captured the entrance of Richard Hayes, handcuffed and flanked by federal marshals. He walked in with a rigid posture, attempting to maintain a semblance of dignity, but every step betrayed his inner panic. Outside, news crews broadcasted live, and hashtags like #Yale banker arrest and #wedding fraud scandal were trending worldwide. Overnight, Richard had gone from admired banker to public pariah. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Emily and Jonathan sat side by side, the weight of the past months etched on their faces. Jonathan remained composed, a steady anchor amidst the chaos, while Emily grappled with conflicting emotions: betrayal, relief, and a lingering sadness for the man she had once loved. Richard's legal team, seasoned and strategic, began their defense. They argued technicalities, procedural errors, and questioned the interpretation of some financial documents. But the prosecution had anticipated every move. Every wire transfer, shell company, and offshore account had been meticulously traced and documented. Every false ledger and manipulated report was cross-referenced and ready for scrutiny. The evidence was airtight. As the trial unfolded, the media frenzy escalated. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, interviewing shocked guests and legal experts. Online forums debated every detail, analyzing Richard's statements, body language, and financial history. Social media memes, ranging from scathing to comical, spread virally. A man who had once curated an image of perfection now became a symbol of arrogance undone by truth. In the courtroom, Richard's confidence began to crumble. Under the relentless questioning of the prosecutors, his explanations faltered. The once smooth Ivy League charm gave way to defensive stammers, nervous glances, and visible agitation. Jurors leaned forward, absorbing every word, every hesitation, every lie unmasked by meticulous documentation. The pivotal moment came when Jonathan, called as a key witness, testified about Richard's calculated deception. Calm, precise, and unwavering, Jonathan outlined the methods Richard had used to siphon millions through fraudulent channels. He explained the patterns, the shell companies, and the intentional concealment of assets. Each statement was backed by evidence, charts, and verified transactions. The courtroom was silent, the gravity of his testimony settling over everyone like a heavy fog. Richard's face drained of color. His attorney tried to interject, but Jonathan's composure and the incontrovertible evidence left little room for argument. The jury's eyes were fixed, and the audience could feel the weight of the revelation. It was clear, this was a man whose arrogance had been exposed, whose schemes were now undeniable, and whose public image had been irrevocably shattered. Outside, the media exploded. Headlines splashed across screens. From Ivy League to infamy, Yale banker exposed. 2.3 million fraud uncovered during wedding scandal. Bride's father outsmarts groom in stunning FBI operation. Public opinion turned sharply against Richard. Former friends and associates distanced themselves, embarrassed or fearful of association. Investors demanded restitution. Colleagues condemned his actions, and social circles that once revered him now ridiculed him. Social media amplified every misstep, every nervous twitch, every admission of guilt, creating a viral storm that engulfed him completely. Meanwhile, Emily observed the trial with a mix of shock and catharsis. Watching Richard's unraveling, she felt the pain of betrayal, but also relief that justice was being served. She realized the depth of his deception, the skill with which he had manipulated appearances, and the severity of the threat he posed to both her family and unsuspecting investors. Jonathan, ever the strategist, remained composed. He had known that the public exposure was necessary, that every detail needed to be presented transparently, and that Richard's arrogance required dismantling both legally and socially. Seeing the jurors absorb the evidence, seeing the media amplify the truth, and witnessing Richard's unraveling confirmed that the plan had succeeded beyond measure. The courtroom proceedings continued over several days, each session peeling back another layer of Richard's fraudulent empire. Expert witnesses detailed the financial intricacies, forensic accountants presented transaction histories, and associates corroborated Jonathan's findings. Every revelation intensified Richard's public humiliation. Every fact made the social media storm more ferocious, and every legal maneuver reinforced the inevitability of his downfall. In the final days of the trial, Richard attempted a last-ditch effort, a plea for leniency, an appeal to sympathy, a narrative of misunderstanding. But the judge, armed with the comprehensive understanding of the case, the irrefutable evidence, and the calculated nature of the crime, rejected all attempts at mitigation. The sentence, when delivered, was firm and uncompromising, ensuring that Richard would face the consequences of his actions for years to come. Emily, standing outside the courthouse after the verdict, felt a profound sense of closure. The ordeal had been painful, humiliating, and deeply emotional, but the justice delivered was absolute. Her father, who had orchestrated the exposure with patience and precision, had protected her from further harm, preserved the integrity of the process, and ensured that accountability was unmistakable. Richard Hayes, once the image of sophistication and charm, now stood as a cautionary tale, a man undone by arrogance, deception, and the inexorable power of truth. His life, meticulously curated for appearances, had crumbled under scrutiny. Social media continued to dissect every moment, every detail, every facial expression, amplifying the spectacle. He was no longer a banker. He was a public lesson in hubris, fraud, and the consequences of underestimating those around him. As Emily and her family walked away from the courthouse, the weight of the past months began to lift. They had witnessed deception at its most sophisticated, justice at its most precise, and the triumph of integrity over arrogance. The scandal, though painful, had reinforced the values Jonathan had always taught: vigilance, truth, and the courage to confront wrongdoing, no matter how deeply hidden. The story of the Yale banker who called his future father-in-law unrefined had now transformed into a narrative far larger, one of exposure, accountability, and a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving, but truth, when pursued with diligence, is inescapable. Richard Hayes awoke to the harsh clang of metal doors and the dull hum of fluorescent lights. The sterile, cold environment of the federal prison was a far cry from the luxury penthouses, yachts, and lavish venues he had once commanded. Gone were the designer suits, the champagne flutes, and the admiring glances. In their place were concrete walls, strict routines, and the constant reminder that freedom was no longer his to enjoy. The first days were disorienting. Richard had spent his life believing in his invincibility. His Ivy League pedigree, professional status, and charm were shields against consequence. Now, every assumption he had made crumbled with each passing hour. Inmates, guards, and the regimented schedules reminded him that status meant nothing here. Respect had to be earned, humility forced, and arrogance, as he would soon discover, was a dangerous liability. Letters and phone calls from former colleagues and friends had stopped almost entirely. Many distanced themselves immediately after his arrest, unwilling to be associated with the criminal now infamous nationwide. Social media continued to dissect his persona. Memes mocked him relentlessly, and journalists recounted the wedding fiasco with glee. The world outside continued its fascination with his downfall, while inside, Richard was forced to confront a life stripped of luxury, pretense, and influence. Emily, meanwhile, was slowly rebuilding her life. The trauma of betrayal lingered, but with Jonathan's guidance, she began to reclaim her sense of self. Therapy, supportive friends, and small personal victories became anchors. She realized that the man she had loved was gone not in the sense of death, but as a version of himself that had been carefully curated and entirely false. The real Richard, exposed in court and behind bars, was someone she had never truly known. Inside prison, Richard's arrogance initially led him into trouble. He underestimated other inmates, dismissed guards' authority, and assumed his financial background would command respect. The result was swift correction, confrontations, isolation, and a realization that his past privileges meant nothing here. Every day was a humbling lesson, forcing him to navigate a world far removed from boardrooms and social events. The legal repercussions continued to unfold. Restitution payments, fines, and ongoing investigations kept him tethered to the consequences of his past actions. Authorities traced remaining assets, ensuring that victims received at least partial recovery. Each discovery reminded Richard that deception had lasting, inescapable effects. His carefully built financial empire, once a source of pride and arrogance, was now dismantled, leaving him with little more than the concrete walls surrounding him. Psychologically, the adjustment was brutal. Isolation from family, public humiliation, and the monotony of incarceration eroded his confidence. Richard began to confront truths he had long ignored: his manipulation of loved ones, his exploitation of trust, and the arrogance that had blinded him to Jonathan's investigation. The man who once believed himself untouchable now faced a stark reflection of reality every day, an existence governed not by charm or wealth, but by discipline, accountability, and reflection. Emily's own life had transformed dramatically. Freed from Richard's manipulation, she embraced her independence. She pursued new opportunities, traveled with friends, and reconnected with family in ways she hadn't experienced before. Her father's careful orchestration of justice had not only protected her, but had also created a space for healing, growth, and empowerment. As the months in prison continued, Richard began to internalize the long-term consequences of his choices. He was no longer the charismatic banker who dazzled clients and society. He was a cautionary tale, a man whose arrogance, greed, and deception had led to public humiliation, the loss of freedom, and a fractured personal life. The media's relentless coverage ensured that his reputation was irreversibly damaged, and the financial losses he had inflicted remained a lasting scar on his legacy. Meanwhile, Jonathan continued to maintain quiet vigilance. The legal system had delivered its verdict, but he monitored ongoing developments, ensuring that any attempts by Richard to manipulate remaining assets or contacts were thwarted. His dedication went beyond personal vindication. It was about preserving justice, integrity, and the safety of others who might have fallen victim to Richard's schemes. Emily reflected often on the lessons learned. The ordeal had forced her to confront painful truths about trust, appearances, and human behavior. She recognized the importance of vigilance, critical thinking, and the courage to act decisively when deception is uncovered. While the trauma remained, the experience also fostered resilience, independence, and a deeper understanding of human complexity. Richard, trapped in his new reality, could only reflect on the consequences of arrogance and deceit. Every day, every interaction, and every moment served as a reminder that life cannot be manipulated indefinitely. That truth will surface, and that integrity remains an inescapable measure of character. His downfall, dramatic and public, had reshaped not only his life, but also the lives of those he had attempted to deceive, leaving an indelible mark on everyone involved. The courtroom and prison drama were behind them, but the echoes of Richard Hayes' downfall lingered. Emily had reclaimed her life, stronger and wiser from the experience. She no longer defined herself by the betrayal she had suffered, but by her resilience, courage, and ability to rebuild after deception. Months after the trial, Emily hosted a quiet gathering for close family and friends. Laughter filled the room, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous year. It was not a wedding, nor a celebration of romance. It was a celebration of survival, integrity, and the lessons learned from a harrowing ordeal. Jonathan, as always, remained calm, his presence a steady anchor. Emily approached him, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Dad," she said softly, "I don't know how to thank you enough. You saved me from a life I didn't even know was a trap. You protected our family and ensured justice was done." Jonathan smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You don't need to thank me. Doing the right thing isn't about recognition. It's about protecting what matters and ensuring truth prevails. You learned that, and that's the most important part." Meanwhile, Richard's life continued in stark contrast. His prison sentence was long, and every day reminded him of the consequences of arrogance, greed, and deception. Former colleagues and investors refused to associate with him. His social media presence, once a showcase of luxury, had been erased from the digital spotlight. He was a man stripped of privilege, influence, and reputation, a living testament to the power of truth and accountability. Emily found herself reflecting often on the experience. She understood now that appearances could be deceiving, charm could mask malevolence, and trust should be earned, not assumed. Her father's wisdom, patience, and meticulous planning had not only exposed Richard, but had also provided her with a roadmap for navigating a world where integrity is not always the default. As the story reached its natural conclusion, Emily and Jonathan looked forward rather than backward. Plans were made for personal growth, travel, and new opportunities. Emily pursued career ambitions and personal passions, while Jonathan continued mentoring, guiding, and protecting those he loved. The past remained a reminder, a lesson engraved in memory, but it no longer dictated their present. The saga of Richard Hayes, the Yale graduate banker who arrogantly dismissed his future father-in-law as unrefined, had become more than just a scandal. It was a story of justice, resilience, and the power of integrity over deception. Families, friends, and even strangers watched the story unfold, captivated by the drama, the betrayal, and the eventual triumph of truth. And now, dear viewer, as you've seen this incredible story of deceit, downfall, and justice, it's your turn to reflect and engage. If you were shocked by Richard's arrogance, inspired by Jonathan's wisdom, or amazed by Emily's resilience, like this video to show your support for truth and integrity. Comment below with your thoughts. What would you have done if you were in Emily's place? And don't forget to subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories of deception, betrayal, and ultimate justice. This story proves that arrogance can be exposed, lies can be revealed, and truth, when pursued with patience and precision, always prevails. Thank you for staying with us through every twist, every revelation, and every shocking moment. Justice has been served, lessons have been learned, and the legacy of integrity shines brighter than any faunt of wealth or charm ever could.